Okay, so this entire talk is about snakes. So if you're someone who's not a big fan of snakes, sorry about that. I'm Leo, and like Holly said, at the moment I'm working over at the Students' Union just across the street. And around this time last year, I was writing my third year research project on snakes here at Newcastle. So snakes are kind of my thing, and I've always really loved snakes since I was little. Most people think that's a bit strange, but I think I got it from my dad because he also really loved snakes, and it, I think, just sort of became my thing as well growing up. This is a picture of Sunny. She's my pet snake, and she doesn't really have much to do with this, but if I was giving a talk on snakes, I figured I might as well have her on the title slide because she's adorable. So I promise there is a snake in every single one of these pictures, but some of them are very well camouflaged. Unsurprisingly, as someone who really likes snakes, I spent a lot of time looking at snakes. When I was younger, I lived in Indonesia, and we used to go out and look for snakes in our neighborhood. I spent a lot of time reading about snakes, looking at pictures of snakes, looking at films and documentaries and TV shows of snakes. So I spent a lot of time just kind of exposed to snakes. And as part of all this, I noticed that, first of all, snakes come in a wide variety of patterns and colors, but also that you can sometimes kind of predict where a snake lives or how it might behave based on its patterns and colors. And to me, that suggested that there must be some sort of relationship between snakes' ecology, which is how they interact with the world around them, and how they look in their pattern and color. I can see a lot of people staring at the slides right now, trying to work out where the snakes are. So 4 of them are fairly obvious. Can we work out where the one in the bottom corner is? Can we see it? Yeah, we can see that one. Can we see the one in the top corner? Because that's the one people tend to struggle with. Okay, we don't have a pointer thingy, but it's sort of like you can vaguely see the shape of the head next to that black leaf there, and then the body kind of snakes backwards. Can we see it?
You could use the mouse.
Yeah, I'll click out and use the mouse. So the head is over there, and the body curves like that. And the other corner, this is the snake's body, and that's the head. So I love these 2 pictures because to me these really show how snakes are so well adapted to their environment and how well camouflaged they can be. The one in that top corner there is a gaboon viper, which is one of the most dangerous snakes in the world, and you really don't want to get bitten by, but fortunately it lives in Africa, not here. And the one in the bottom corner is a Malagasy leaf-nosed snake because its nose looks a bit like a leaf. So like I was saying, I could kind of see sort of patterns and trends in how snakes looked based on where they live and how they behave. So that's what I ended up writing my third year project on. And I'm not going to go through every single bit on the slide because I've been told by people outside of my degree that it looks like just a bunch of line and dots, and honestly I think that's fair enough. But all you need to know is I spent several months finding a lot of snake pictures online, reading a lot about snakes in papers and journal articles, and doing some fancy stuff on a computer with help from my supervisor. And I looked at snakes from all over the world, spent a lot of time in a very large Excel spreadsheet, kind of took over my life for a few months, and I absolutely loved it. So my dissertation was focused on how snake ecology affects their coloration. Because ecology is how an organism interacts with the world around it, this meant I was interested in things like where a snake lives, like whether it's in the forest or in the savannas or in swamps or marshes or whatnot. Things like what it eats, because, for example, if you've got a snake that eats fish, then it's eating something that can't see very well. But if you've got a snake that eats birds or mice, then it's eating something with fairly good eyesight. I was interested in things like how venomous a snake was, because in a lot of animals, like in this poison dart frog, highly toxic animals have really bright colors, and it's kind of a warning signal to predators going, don't eat me, because if you do, you'll have a really nasty time. So I was curious to see if this pattern was in snakes as well. And these were some of the things I was interested in finding out going into my project. So all animals need to be worried about how well camouflaged they are, but on snakes there's kind of an extra pressure on top of this. So there's this theory called the snake detection theory, and it's the theory that primate brains are wired to spot snakes more easily than they are to spot other animals. And this was a study by some scientists in Japan where they found that, so these pictures are just sort of at different stages of blurriness, I suppose, and they found that generally people could spot the snake at a kind of blurrier stage than they could spot an equivalent animal, a different animal at the same stage of blurriness. So you'd be able to spot a blurred snake faster than you'd be able to spot a bird or a cat or a mouse. And the theory is this is because snakes are kind of distinctly and almost unnaturally shaped, and they are often venomous, and that means we have an advantage if we can spot them quickly. But for snakes, this means that their camouflage has to be very, very good, because otherwise they're very easily spotted. So I won't go into this bit into too much detail, but before I started my project, I found some studies that other people had done on what affects snake pattern and colour. So there were some theories around the fact that where a snake lives would affect its pattern and colour. There were theories that how quickly a snake moves or how much it tends to move might affect its pattern, how it hunts other animals, that might affect its pattern, how venomous it is, that might affect its pattern. And honestly, a lot of this lined up with what I did end up finding in my project, because I found that the three things that contributed the most to snake colour and pattern were habitat, so what kind of environment it lives in, its system, so which part of the environment it lives in, whether it lives on the ground or in the trees, and how it hunts, so whether it's an active hunter that chases down its prey, or whether it's an ambush predator that just kind of hides in the leaf litter all day like that gaboon viper where no one can see it. And honestly, it's really not a surprise that habitat and system were so important, because you need to be able to blend in with your surroundings, or everything else will be able to spot you from a mile away. So we've got that snake living in the trees in the forest, which is very green. And that's actually also another very highly venomous snake. Lots of very highly venomous snakes are hard to spot, but that's an eastern mamba, an eastern green mamba. We've got in the top, we've got a mud snake, which spends a lot of its time in mud, and it's kind of like quite brown, dull, kind of patchy. And we've got a reticulated python in the bottom corner, which spends most of its time on land, on forest floors, and it's got a lot of greys, a lot of browns, and that sort of broken up reticulated pattern, which makes it hard to spot in leaf litter. So unsurprisingly, arboreal snakes, snakes that live in trees, were mostly green. And I don't think that requires a ton of explanation, because if you're spending all your time in leaves, you're going to want to be the same color as the leaves. So here we've got a vine snake, we've got one of the Asian pit vipers, and we've got a green tree python, and they're all green because they all live in trees and spend a lot of time in leaves. I found that, on the other hand, snakes which live mostly on the ground and are ambush predators tend to be patchy. These patches work really, really well to camouflage snakes that don't move a lot, because it lets them blend in really well with their surroundings. But if they're moving, then the patches, because they're so solid and distinct, make them easier to see. So here the snakes have kind of prioritized the ability to stay hidden when still, as opposed to being hard to see when moving. And then on the opposite end of the scale, we've got snakes that live in grasslands and which are active hunters. So in the grasslands, they're very exposed. As active hunters, they've got to be moving around very quickly, and they tended to be stripy. They tended to have a sort of long stripes from their eyes down to their tail, like in these rat snakes here and in that keel back there. And that's because, I think, of something called motion dazzle, where if you've got bold striped patterns, it's harder to see something when it's moving. It's like that illusion with barber poles where it's bold striped lines, and when it's moving, it's hard to track, it's hard to see what's going on. It's the reason why old warships were painted in that kind of zebra pattern, because it meant when they were moving quickly at sea, they would be harder to track visually, it would be harder to tell how quickly they were moving. And while they're still, the snakes are fairly conspicuous, like in that garter snake there. But when they're moving quickly, it's hard to tell how quickly they're moving. It's hard to tell which direction they're moving. And then they stop, and those stripes help them blend in with like tall blades of grass. And then they move again, and it's hard to see them. So these stripy snakes that lived in highly exposed grasslands and spent a lot of time chasing other animals as active hunters took advantage of this motion dazzle effect. And then there were banded snakes, which were kind of an in-between between those very motion dazzly striped snakes and patchy snakes, which didn't spend a lot of time moving. I found that banded snakes were often terrestrial, so lived on land and lived in wetlands, so not quite as exposed as grasslands. My theory was that the bands helped the snakes blend in when they were still. So again, there are snakes in every one of these pictures. Those two are fairly conspicuous. Can we see the one in the vertical picture? It's black and white, and it's banded, and it's completely still. Do we want me to point it out with the mouse again?
Please.
So again, this is a highly venomous snake. This is a multi-banded crate from Asia, and there it is. So while it looks really conspicuous when they're still like this, even though they're very bright, highly contrasting colors, they actually do a really good job of helping the snake blend in with their surroundings when they're still, because it kind of breaks up their shape. At the same time, even though the motion dazzle effect when these banded snakes are moving isn't as strong as with, let's ignore that, as with striped snakes, it still is there. So these banded snakes were kind of that in between, the kind of jack of all trades between being able to hide really well when still, not quite as well as, say, that gaboon viper earlier, but still being hard to see when they were moving quickly. Not quite as hard to see as, say, a garter snake, which is just the stripes along its side, but it's still hard to track. So I found this project really, really interesting. I really enjoyed the time I spent on it. And I loved learning about why all of my favorite snakes look the way they do. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me ramble about snakes, and I'll leave us off with a picture of my pet snake from last night while I was writing this presentation, when she decided to fall off the sofa and hide inside it. Thank you.